I think as I have gotten older, one of the things that I recognize about myself is that I have come to prefer routine. And when things get disrupted out of that routine, it just throws me off. It's like when I leave home to come to the office during the week, that if there is an accident on the freeway and it has a potential of delaying me even 10 minutes, I just freak out. Because I expect that when I get on the freeway, I should be able to travel at a fair amount of speed all the way down to the office. That's my routine. I'm not a good commuter, so it's important for me to have that kind of routine. And when it gets disrupted, I can tell right away that my fingers, my hands, are gripped around the wheel, white knuckle, and I am gritting my teeth and dare anyone get in my way because I've got to get there. And that's the disruption that comes from a routine being disrupted. Now, I'm sure that none of you have routines that you're used to, right? How many have routines that you've gotten used to? What are some of the things in your routine that you just kind of look for and expect to happen all the time? What are some of the things that you expect to look for? So that has to happen all the time, right? Anybody else? Any other kinds of things of your routines? The newspaper better be in the driveway. I expect that when I turn on the computer in the morning that it better go on. If by chance that it's been downloading updates the night before and it is only at 10% and I expect to have my computer at 100%, I'm not about to wait 10 minutes. I go right to my phone and I can do it right on my phone and I don't have to worry about the stupid computer. That's another routine. Anybody else? Any other routines? Components or things of your routines? Yes?
I expect to unload the dishwasher.
Yeah, I know.
And if there aren't dishes in the cabinet, oh well.
So after I had been away for 2 weeks, I expected that Steve had gotten into the routine of making the coffee in the morning. So the next morning after I had come back from Israel, I woke up in the morning and the coffee wasn't made. And he said, well, because that's my job, your job. I said, but your routine has been for 2 weeks to make the coffee. Why didn't you make the coffee? Because in line 35 of the marriage license, it says that I do the coffee. Isn't that true, those of you who are married? Didn't you have those kinds of things like that in the routines? I say that because we kind of expect things to go along. I get up in the morning, I expect the coffee to be ready, I give the dog a little treat, I go in, I turn on the TV to watch the news, I pick up the computer, I go, I have a few more cups of coffee than I had my breakfast. Well, you get the idea that it's kind of sad, and that's how it is every day, right? Being in Israel for 2 weeks, I mean, it was just absolutely incredible. My regular breakfast is oatmeal, walnuts, and blueberries. In Israel, they had these grand buffets of everything. And I got out of the habit of having walnuts, oatmeal, and blueberries. It's like, where are the eggs and the fresh vegetables and everything, right? So you get into a routine, into a pattern, into a habit of doing things. And I think that's a part of how it is often with our faith community and even in our own individual lives of faith. Things become a routine. We kind of expect, right? We saw it at the beginning of summer when we changed the time of our service. That we had people coming like after the service was already over because the routine was that the service is always at 11:15, not 10 o'clock in the morning. And so people get used to things, and when those routines get disrupted, we don't quite know what to do. It makes us angry sometimes. And also, right, all you have to do is have one of those routines during the day off, and doesn't it throw off the whole rest of the day? You feel lost the whole rest of the day. I do. It's like I'm always catching up during the day because something went off on the routine, and I'm trying to catch up. I'm not sure what I'm trying to catch up to, but I'm trying to catch up to something. I say that, again, in terms of the routine that we find in our lives of faith. So what's been happening with the lectionary is that we're making this progress towards Jerusalem. And we know what's going to happen there. That's how the lectionary works. So when it comes to the end of the church year, as I suggested last year, that the focus of the scripture becomes the end of the journey for Jesus, his suffering, death, and resurrection. But also the end when, as the early Christians began to expect in their routine of faith, that Jesus said that this generation wouldn't pass away before they would see him come again. And so the early church community really did take him at his word and expected him to return within their lifetime. And pretty soon a generation comes and goes, and another generation comes and goes, and Jesus didn't seem to return. And so it disrupted their routine. They expected something. They were following the path, if you will. And when he didn't return, they began to lose faith. Many of them did. They became greatly concerned. They were anxious. And so the scriptures were often directed at that point in the life of the Christian community when the anxiety and the disappointment that it didn't work out the way that they wanted to, the scriptures and the tradition begins to address that for them. Well, maybe we misheard it. Maybe that wasn't really what he said. Or it works this way. Maybe it's already happened. So that maybe this end or this return of Jesus is something that isn't going to happen in our lifetime, but will happen out in the future. But what we are expected to do in the meantime, as we wait for the final coming of Jesus, is to live our faith in the moment, in the now, in the present, in such a way that what becomes important is not the return of Jesus anymore, but what becomes important is the example of the life of Jesus that we're expected to give on a routine basis, every day. Not just on Sunday, but every day. So that the routine is that if we're caught up in this vision of God's reign, the kingdom of God, and if we're caught up in the example of Jesus, that it means, and I remember saying one time on the trip in Israel, you know, it's like when it's convenient for us, it's easy. But in the life of faith, in the Christian life of faith, we're challenged more often with inconvenience. And it's when it's inconvenient that we are to give that example even more fully, more completely. Because when it's inconvenient is when it is harder, and the choices and decisions are more difficult to make, but we're expected to give it even more so, to compensate for what isn't present at that moment. And so a part of what the early Christian community had to figure out in that is that if the routine of our lives requires of us a constant effort to bear the example of Christ to the world and to live in the reign of God, and in a sense those are two different things. To follow the example of Jesus means making choices and decisions in our daily activity for the life of Jesus, but also in the midst of the larger vision of the reign of God that isn't just about me and Jesus or my individual faith, but what really God intends for the whole world. So the routine of life, meaning the routine of our Christian life, is not just about me getting me saved, but rather how is the world being changed and transformed so that it more fully reflects the vision of God's reign. How does that happen? How will that happen? How can it happen, in a sense? So the early Christian community, now imagine being in the first century and hearing these words of the prophet Joel. The first thing that probably jumps out at you is the last part of the scripture. There's going to be signs and there's going to be destructions, and I'm sure the people in Sonoma seeing the fires come up over the hill, right? Oh my God, this is the end. And so you could interpret and read only from Joel that part of the scripture, and miss really what's the most important part of it. Okay, so all of those things happen. So the world is coming apart. So it seems to be ending. not just physically, but lots of things seem to be ending. So in the midst of that, what are we to do? You see, that's a part of the daily routine. How in the midst of everything that we experience, from the good things to the bad things, to the easy things to the difficult things, what is it that enables us to do those two things I've suggested? Live the example of Jesus and carry with us the vision of God's reign. Well, it says this. This is what's going to happen. And it shouldn't surprise us that this text becomes the key text for the Christian community in understanding one event in Jesus' life, but also of understanding that same event in each of our lives. And it has to do with baptism. So that the early Christians, in trying to figure out why Jesus was baptized, or why he had to be baptized, hear echoing in the distance, background, this text from Joel. In those days, I will pour out my Spirit upon you. If you remember how, and here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, in relation to where we're going at the end of Jesus' ministry, that the baptismal scene says, in almost all the accounts, including John, that what either Jesus or the crowd see is the Spirit descending on Jesus. To them, that was the fulfillment of this text from Joel. In other words, they knew that their lives, as they were being disrupted by their encounter with Jesus, that the routine of everything that they had done up to that point, as it was now being disrupted in their encounter with Jesus, and the expectation that they were to be living now, not as Jews or Gentiles or pagans or atheists, but now as disciples and followers of Jesus, that in the midst of that upheaval in their lives, that the Spirit had descended not just on Jesus, but the Spirit had descended upon them. And that in the way that the Spirit had descended upon them, that they were filled with, not a dove from heaven, but they were filled with the Spirit of God. And that was what was going to enable them to establish a new routine in life that was filled with the Spirit. Well, think about it. It's not just about baptism, but when else can we talk about the Spirit descending on not just individuals like Jesus or us, but descending upon humanity? When else did that take place? Pentecost. It happened at Pentecost. Well, we've got two places now where in the midst of this struggle to establish a new routine of life, shaped by the example of Jesus and filled with the vision of God's reign, that the Spirit of God has come down, dwelling in our midst, filling us as individuals, filling us as communities of believers and disciples, filling us in such a way that there's no reason why we can't do the new routine of Jesus' life. Because the Spirit enables us, empowers us, motivates us, comforts us, calms us, de-stresses us. That the Spirit of God dwells in us and in our midst in a powerful way, so that the vision that we have of God's reign remains clear. And it enables us to walk the example of Jesus more completely and more readily. And here's the rub. Lest you think that I don't like to rub people perhaps the wrong way or cause discomfort. But you have to take what I've just said and understand that in that powerful vision of the Spirit coming upon us, where we continue to dream dreams and visions of the future filled with hope and understanding that the past is what we bring forward with us, that in that vision of God's reign and in the example of Jesus, that the Spirit enables, empowers, as I've just said, and motivates us. That in the midst of that, there's still always the daily choice. The daily choice. And that's the rub. because that can't become routine for us. It can't be assumed that we already know what choices we have to make each day. It can't be assumed. Because the minute we begin to assume that we know what choices we need to make is when we take them for granted. And when we take those choices for granted, it becomes too easy to not make them. To not make them. And here's where the gospel comes in. This is so hard. It's so hard because we live in a time when there are far too many Pharisees out there in the world. Far too many Pharisees who like to promote themselves and build themselves up on the backs of poor people and alienated people. And they like to make us think that they are so great and so wonderful and so powerful that it makes the rest of us feel pretty puny. And so there's lots of Pharisees in the church, around us, in governments, in the world around us. There are so many Pharisees that like to promote themselves that we could become convinced that that's how we should be. See how good I am? See how great I am? See how much money I give? See how good you must feel because I'm so great. And we can become convinced that that's true. And when we do, we're filled with a sense of awe and wonderment at those who make big things about themselves. And it's no wonder that off in the corner is the tax collector. And remember, in Jesus' community, who stood at the top of the social ladder? Who stood at the top of the economic ladder? Who stood at the top of the religious ladder? The Pharisee. Where did the tax collector figure in? Somewhere just above women and children. At the bottom. This tax collector should be given no time at all because he deals in unclean money. And if he deals in unclean money, see, he's the one who takes the Roman coins for the taxes and then has to figure out how to give just proportionate out to those who are required for it to be given to, that he's unclean. And so he's not even worthy to stand anywhere in the temple at all because he has no right to it. That's what the Pharisee says. You have no right to be here. I do. I filled this space so fully and completely that there's no room for anyone else, especially you dirty, unclean tax collector. And see, when you hold that position of yourself, you begin to think that God only cares about you. And it becomes easy to not think that the tax collector might exactly be the one who is more pleasing to God. There's the rub. So the tax collector stands off to the side and says, notice how he's described. He has been put down so often, excluded so often, that he can't even raise his eyes to heaven. He has so little self-worth and so little self-confidence that he can't even imagine that God would give him a moment of time. And yet, who is the one that is actually righteous and whose prayers get heard? Not the one who thinks more of himself, but the one who has thought less of himself. In a bad way, in a certain sense, but in an important way. And that's the last line. This last line of the Scripture, all Gospels have it. So it must be a line in the gospel that speaks the voice of Jesus, most importantly. So, here's the connector. If this routine of life that we are to have as Christians involves that two-part idea that we are first to be examples of Jesus, and secondly, to be agents of that vision of God's reign in the world, and that our daily routine has to be shaped by those two realities. That's what I'm trying to help you understand. That takes priority over everything else. Perhaps even the morning coffee, God forbid. That takes priority, so that every moment of our day is asking ourselves the question, how am I an example of Jesus, and how am I bringing the vision of God's reign to the world? That's the most important thing. That's the only thing that matters for us as Christians. But in a way that doesn't promote us, doesn't make us so proud of ourselves and so self-righteous and so magnanimous that we just think the most of ourselves in the world. But that rather we are always ready to think of the other first. The other first. Even more, not just the other. We're always asking the question, how is this going to bring hope and life to the poorest of the poor? How will this bring life to those at the edges and at the margins? U.S. Catholic bishops in their economic pastoral letter said this: every economic choice and decision has to have as its first concern, what will this do to the poorest of the poor? Do we ever have that thought in our lives each day? You see, that's an essential component of Jesus' life. If that's an essential component of Jesus' life, then it has to be an essential component of our life. If we're so quick and willing to exalt ourselves to say how good of Christians we are, and yet we're not willing to shift the focus of our routine to asking questions how what we do affects others, then indeed the example of Jesus will not get shown, and he will not bring the reign of God to the world. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself, thinking of others first, especially the poorest of the poor, will be exalted. There's the routine.